Welcome and good morning or evening to our guests, students, faculty, alumni, colleagues, and friends. My name is Marcella Del Signore. I'm an associate professor and director of the MS in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design and the School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. And I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this event on behalf of our Dean, Maria Perbellini. New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design is participating through multiple venues to the 17th International Architecture Exhibition, Venice Biennale 2021. Some of the work of our students is in fact exhibited in the Italian pavilion titled Resilient Communities, curated by Alessandro Mellis. In the section Architecture as Caregiver, curated by our Dean Perbellini. Today's event is also part of the virtual Italian pavilion City X Venice, curated by Tom Kovac and Alessandro Mellis with creative director Maria Perbellini. This event is a joint collaboration of New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design and DigitalFUTURES, Tongji University, Shanghai. The theme of our lecture series is Correlational Crisis. 2020 marked a critical year in which environmental, health, and economic and social crises had become correlated, bringing forth the emergence of unforeseen global issues to be addressed with urgency. The summer and fall of 2021 lectures and event series at the School of Architecture and Design and New York Institute of Technology creates opportunity to discuss how architecture, design, and urbanism can disclose implicit parameters and activate structural transformations in our ecological, social, and built environments. From how reality is measured and validated to automation and computational thinking, the series aims to question possibilities for disciplinary action. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome everybody. My name is Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, and I am the chair of the Lectures and Events Committee, and also the director of the new MS in Architecture Computational Technologies at the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Institute of Technology. On behalf of Dean Maria Perbellini, Chair Giovanni Santamaria, and the Lectures and Events Committee, I would like to welcome all of you to our last lecture and event series for the summer of 2021. Today's event, as Marcella said, is part of the virtual Italian Pavilion City X, and also is a joint collaboration between our School of Architecture and Design and DigitalFUTURES, Tongji University. So thank you, Neil Leach, for establishing this collaboration, and also thank you to my colleague Tom Verebes for articulating it. This event is also part of our two new programs, the MS in Architecture Computational Technologies and the MS in Architecture Health and Design at the School of Architecture at the New York Tech. The title of today's event is Artificial Intelligence, Urbanism, Ethics, and Design. This is the second delivery of this event. And today we're going to concentrate on AI ethics in design. Artificial intelligence as a disruptive technology is shifting paradigms at many levels through automation, revealing deep cultural problems in our society by means of how neural networks are being trained and repositories tagged through problematic categories. While we are at an earlier age in automation and we expect these issues to be less problematic, cultural issues seem to be as structural as the technology implemented. At the same time, a digital feudalism in which secure cryptography is only feasible at concentrated levels of power evidently reveals the fact that hackers, AI hackers bots fight AI security bots at increasing speed, and in which users' small error will be enough to validate this feudal protection, accentuating the power control now in hands of very few corporations. Both issues, cultural deconstruction through computational power and increasing political and economic power concentration, are defining how the technology is being applied, presenting ethical issues that reveal our society's challenges. Now I would like to give the word to my colleague Tom Verebes, who's also co-organizing this event, who will be doing a brief introduction and proceed to introduce this event's panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of our Dean, Maria Perbellini, our school, we'd like to thank Philip Yuan, Neil, the entire DigitalFUTURES team, Antonio and Gustavo here on our Zoom, and Neil, and everyone at Tongji University for hosting this event, and our Lectures and Events Committee. And lastly, thank you and welcome to our presenters and panelists and the online audience joining us today. We'll introduce our panel in a moment. Just a few more words before we really get started. Today's event, which is a follow-up from an earlier event in June, AI Design and Ethics, which we had hosted at NYIT and the virtual Italian pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And we addressed artificial intelligence in these two events, well, in relation to design and its consideration within ethics. In the context of correlational crises, which Pablo and Marcella had expressed just earlier in their introductions, the impact of AI systems is affecting the entirety of our environment and society on a planetary scale, including the non-human living flora, fauna, and our precious oceans and our planet's non-living geology. We hope today to initiate a discussion on the socio-political and economic dependent aspects of this context, which influence and implicate design at all different scales and all different kinds of disciplines. All well-intended design requires an ethical stance and should be upheld to a high moral status. In this event, we aim to address the ethical consequences of artificial intelligence, including the politics of design and an examination of the ethical problems which can either be accentuated or mitigated by AI. We launched this event to question the broad context of technology, capitalism, power, and its impact on our planetary ecology, as well as the marginalization and economic imbalances our global economic model can affect. The societal, human, and environmental impact of technological advancement and increasing autonomy will be raised in presentations today. And the questions surrounding how human bias is built into AI and how AI algorithms are trained and the decisions made by programmed algorithms will be interrogated with the aim to ascertain the status of human agency, creativity, innovation, and ultimately the shifting roles and responsibilities of the designer in this rapidly changing technological milieu. On the one hand, and in a broad sense, the impact of AI upon the user of architectural space or the subject or the citizen will be explored. We're grateful to have us join us today, experts working in the areas of philosophy and ethics, cultural studies, design, fashion, and cinema. I'll introduce, well, our two panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Safiya Umoja, has canceled, unfortunately, at the very last minute. She's very unwell today and is unable to join us. But on behalf of Pablo and myself, who've organized and will moderate this event, we'll introduce Mark Coeckelbergh, Vice Dean and Professor at University of Vienna, and Behnaz Farahi, Assistant Professor at the School of Cinematic Arts at, sorry, we've got the, sorry, I've got the correct, forgive me.
School of Design, Tom.
School of Design at California, sorry, I've got it correctly here, California State University at Long Beach. Forgive me about that. I'll introduce our first presenter, Mark Coeckelbergh, who is Vice Dean and Professor at University of Vienna. He'll be giving a presentation titled Ethics of AI in Architecture, and Mark will offer an overview of ethical issues raised by the use of AI in architecture, and this presentation will focus on the ethics of automation in the context of human-technology relations. Mark Coeckelbergh is a full professor of philosophy of media and technology at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. His expertise focuses on ethics and technology, in particular robotics and artificial intelligence. He's currently a member of various entities that support policy building in the area of robotics and artificial intelligence, such as the high-level expert group of AI, which advises the European Commission and the Austrian Robotics Council, established by the Austrian government to support policy building in the area of robotics. the Austrian Advisory Council on Automated Mobility, the Foundation for Responsible Robots, and the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations in Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems. He's also the former president of the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and author of 14 philosophy books, and has been involved in the interdisciplinary collaborations in the context of European research projects, several of them. And Mark has published several books quite recently, in fact, in the last couple of years. Green Leviathan, or the Poetics of Political Liberty, AI Ethics, wonderful, concise, and insightful book on AI ethics, and Defamiliarization Technology, Habituation, and the Need for a Structural Approach, published in Foundations of Science. Join us, please, to welcome Mark Coeckelbergh.
Thank you, Tom, for your kind introduction. This was great. I also would like to thank the hosts and organizers of this event. I think it's a really exciting topic, and I'm pleased to be here this afternoon for me. So let me share my slides and talk a bit about the ethics of AI in the context of architecture. So you should see my screen now, and yes, do you see the title slide? Okay.
Yes.
So let me start with saying something about AI in architecture and design, and then go into some ethical problems that are raised by automation in architecture, ending with a specific theme that is close to my heart these days. So if we look at AI in a more historical context, then we see that in many technological practices, or rather that in many architectural practices, the technology was already involved. So architecture itself was already a technological practice before AI turned up. AutoCAD, ArchiCAD, and other tools were there already, and automated design to some extent. And when we are, going to talk a bit about the new role of the architects, it's definitely a case that many buildings are already erected without involvement of architects. So the question about the place of the architect in society, in architecture, in creating the built environment is also a long-standing theme. Now, AI today offers new possibilities in architecture, and not only at the level of buildings, but also at the level of neighborhoods, of cities. So basically, with the availability of data, just as in many other sectors, it's now possible to, for example, base architecture on engineering requirements, but also, for example, urban data. So it's possible to shape the urban spaces. And often these technologies are also combined with other new technologies. For example, virtual reality experience technology is now giving an overview to people of possible designs. So you can experience walking around in a building, for example, in a city, without actually, having to build a city in the first place, just to see how would that place, how would that space feel, and what kind of place are we making. I would like today to zoom in on the ethical problems raised by automation in architecture and design, and there I would like to stress that just as some people in architecture theory have said, this is really about the means, about the instruments. Of course, ethics can always be about the ends we choose, about what is the goal of architecture. But what I'm going to talk about has to do with the instrument itself. It has to do with what philosophers of technology like me call a non-instrumental conception of technology, meaning that the technology is not just a tool. In this case, AI is not just a tool. So what kind of problems do we encounter? Ethical, but also problems of a political nature, of a power nature. Well, first of all, there is, if AI in architecture is used, there is data collection. Where do these data come from? And do the architects sufficiently understand the inputs? Because that's often a problem that even technical people, they work with data, but they don't really understand where the data come from and if they have been collected in an ethical way. Then also who's in control, right? So to what extent is AI in control when it's used in architecture? For now, parameters still proposed by human architects. Architects still make choices between possibilities offered by the system. And if that would be taken over too, then the question is like, do architects still have control over what they're doing, and do they still know really what they're doing, given that so much gets delegated to AI? So for the future, I foresee a problem of responsibility. Because since Aristotle, being responsible in order to exercise a responsibility, not only as a professional, but in general, you need to know what you're doing and you need to be in control. So if that's no longer the case, one could question if it's still possible to do architecture in a responsible way. Another issue is the feeling that there's a loss of power here, that AI takes over. And so architects may rightly ask, like, who is the architect when AI assumes such an important role? My take on this, based on philosophy of technology that is more constructive and positive about human-machine collaboration, is like, well, architects can collaborate with AI. However, even if we accept it in general, there's still a question regarding the place, identity, and role of architects. So the question is, for example, as Wood puts it, are architects reduced to data entry clerks? These are they only involved in entering the data? And is the machine really making the architectural and design decisions? So there's a worry that from a kind of all-powerful demiurge kind of position, the architects gets reduced to a participant in the process and a mediator. Now, I don't think that's necessarily problematic, or it's not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, many, just as authors of literary works, there's a death of the author, and there could also perhaps be the death of the architect, and that doesn't need to be a bad thing to reconceive your role as a participant in technological processes, as long as you can actually bring in typically human capacities. And this takes us to the next point, that there is a worry that when more is taken over by the technology, that architects lose their skills. However, they can learn new skills. And I would propose that architects try to use these typically human capacities, the capacity to feel surroundings, for example, aided by VR, but really, still having that sense, that feeling. Also the experience of beauty. And finally, of course, human creativity itself. Although there might be some forms of machine creativity, this is a huge area in computing, for discussion. But I think human creativity is something that we want to preserve. And so the question is on how to preserve it in the context of this human-machine collaboration, in the context of what I would call a cyborg kind of mode. Finally, I think architecture is and was always also about communication. And this leads me to the next question, because I think we should not only ask like who is responsible, say the machine or the architect for the design, we should also ask like to whom are architects responsible? And ask this question when artificial intelligence is used, because often artificial intelligence is not really interpretable, it's not really explainable, not really transparent. And this is a problem when, as an architect, you then have to explain to your clients, to the people, to all kind of stakeholders that have an interest in what's going to happen in the future. You have to explain why you chose a certain design, why you designed a building, a city in a certain way. But can you still do that when architects, when AI takes over a lot of tasks in architecture? So that's a problem. Also, the larger context is AI here used to boost efficiency and maximization of profit, supporting capitalism, or is also used to empower people? How can it be used to empower people? And finally, when we ask the question to whom should be responsible, we should also ask like, are there also non-human values important, right? So one could try as architects, as designers, to have human values incorporated in design, and this could be seen as responsible architecture. But I think it's also important to look at the non-humans, to look at the non-built environment, the environmental context, climate, and so on. So these were some specific problems I see in the case of architecture. We can also talk about more problems, for example, bias and exploitation. In my book, AI Ethics, I say more about that. What I would like to do in the second half of this presentation is to stress the political problems and the problems regarding climate and environment. First of all, who participates in decisions about whether to use AI or not in architecture, in decisions about the design, and how can also political values like democracy be integrated in architecture, given that AI plays this big role. And I think this becomes more difficult when, as Pablo also already suggested in his introduction, when we have this power of big tech. It's an asymmetrical power situation where the power of all kinds of users, including architects, is reduced and also is reduced on a global scale. So we have this global context, I think. And if we're going to rethink architecture in the context of AI, in the light of AI and its new possibilities, we should look at also those global problems, such as the climate crisis, and see how architecture can contribute to dealing with that. Because I think ethics and politics, and indeed architecture and design, are not just about humans. They're also about environments, about animals, non-human animals, and so on. And my worry is that in a context of the Anthropocene, in a context where humanity at the scale of the Earth has taken hyper agency, has really completely transformed the Earth, what does that mean for architecture? Are architects a kind of new demiurges that are not only concerned with being in control of the building, of the built environment in a city, but also is humanity basically a kind of meta architect? Is humanity a demiurge that shapes the whole planet? And if so, should that be allowed? Is that a kind of hubris? Is that are limits needed to that? And if it's allowed to the extent that it's allowed, how can this kind of process be done in a responsible way? And what does it mean for architects as participants in this kind of processes of making that go from the very, very small scale of making buildings, designing buildings, to the scale of transforming the Earth? And I call this poetic processes of making and creation, which always, I think, slip beyond our control somehow, even if we try to gain control. So that's a kind of problematic, I think, that could be more important in the future. And in my book, Green Leviathan, you can find more about the, what do political values mean in the age of climate change and artificial intelligence. So I conclude that AI for architecture, I think, gives us a lot of new opportunities. I think that collaboration between humans and machines leads to a redefinition of the role of architects, requires a redefinition of the role of architects, which I think should be based on a new understanding of themselves as participators, mediators in poetic processes, based on the capacities that are very human, capacities of sensing spaces, sensing the built environment and other environments, creativity, and also communication, where we try also to be responsible to other people and explain as professionals, whether it's philosophers or architects, what we are doing. Finally, I think, therefore, we should educate architects and software developers about the ethics, about all these aspects, and have discussions that connect humanities with technical, with the arts and design and architecture, because I think these questions in a global earthly context will become much more important in the near future already. And a question like, should there be limits to human design and hyper-agency in the Anthropocene, I think is very relevant. And I hope we can touch upon that in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really wonderful presentation of the ethics, the politics related to architecture and urbanism, and ultimately really the position and power and potential to affect the world, and the changing role and responsibility of the architect. Pablo, do you want to take over and introduce Behnaz?
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Great presentation, and also we appreciate the engagement with the context. So thank you for your presentation. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Behnaz Farahi, Assistant Professor, School of Cinematic Arts, University of Southern California, and Director of Farahi Architecture, Fashion, Interactive Design. Behnaz's lecture is called AI, Surveillance, and the Gaze. What does it mean to live in our digital culture, where our bodies are enmeshed in the materiality of machine algorithms, sensors, and digital processes? How could AI systems undermine the underlying unjust biases and serve to empower those who face injustice? This presentation addresses the notion of the gaze and surveillance in our contemporary digital media from social and political perspectives. Through the implementation of computer vision, biometric sensor technologies, and machine learning algorithms, this presentation examines how different strategies of the gaze can be seen to undermine various forms of power structure and to promote forms of resistance. It also explores how literal masks may hide or reveal new identities, and other strategies to marginalize groups to develop their own secret language. This presentation avoids technological determinism rather than rehashing arguments as whether surveillance is good or bad. It takes an intersectional critical feminist approach to illustrate what constitutes the gaze and surveillance and what might prove to be effective strategies of resistance in creative practices. Behnaz is trained as an architect. Behnaz Farahi is an award-winning designer and critical maker based in LA. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary media arts and practice from USC School of Cinematic Arts. Currently, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Design, California State University, Long Beach. Farahi explores how to foster an empathetic relationship between the human body and the space around it using computational systems. Her work addresses critical issues such as feminism, emotion, perception, and social interaction. She is the co-editor of an issue of AD, 3D Printed Body Architecture, 2017, and Interactive Futures, forthcoming. Thank you, Behnaz, for joining us, and please, we welcome you to our lectures and event series.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Tom and Marcelo, and all the organizers of these amazing events. I'm very happy to be here. With that, I'm going to share my screen. And hear the sound? Where we are immersed in the world of machine learning algorithms, computer vision, and biometric sensors. But what does this all mean? Might these computational systems not replicate, somewhat disturbingly, our underlying biases and serve to reinforce the marginalization of those who have typically been excluded? Is AI necessarily complicit in replicating human prejudice? Or are there ways of deploying AI as a means of exposing human bias? I would suggest that there are potential strategies that could be deployed for AI to actually overcome bias. In this presentation, I'm going to address notions of the gaze, surveillance, and ways of seeing through the lens of my own creative practice. By implementing computer vision technologies, I hope to examine how different strategies of the gaze can be seen to undermine various forms of power structure and to promote forms of resistance. Here I'm trying to avoid any form of technological determinism. Rather than rehashing arguments as to whether surveillance is good or bad, I hope to take an intersectional feminist approach to show what constitute the gaze and surveillance, and to consider what strategies of resistance might be proved to be effective in art and design practices. In my work, I have used various computer vision technologies to enhance human perception. For example, this is an emotive wearable which can recognize and respond to the facial expressions of people around with different types of behaviors. This type of smart, soft robotic garment could potentially benefit those with autism who have difficulties recognizing facial expressions. Another work, Iridescence, is an emotive collar equipped with a facial tracking camera and an array of rotating quills, which respond to the movement of onlookers and their facial expressions. Similar to how a blind person could sense through haptic information, the movement of the wearable would allow the wearer to sense where people are standing and the emotions they're expressing, even with her eyes closed. Here I hope to address two questions related to the notion of the gaze. Firstly, what does it mean to be observed? Secondly, what do we see when we look out at the world? Through my argument, I use gaze as an interchangeable concept which could be shared between human and machine. This takes us to the historical concept of panopticon. The panopticon refers to a type of institutional building and a system of control envisioned by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham in 18th century. The layout of the panopticon allows a guard to observe occupants without them knowing whether or not they're being watched. French philosopher Michel Foucault revitalizes interest in the panopticon in his 1975 book Discipline and Punish, and uses it to illustrate such a model could be applied to disciplinary societies in order to control their citizens. He described the prisoner of a panopticon as being at the receiving end of asymmetrical surveillance. As a consequence, the inmate policies himself for fear of punishment. What is fascinating about this example is that rather than external actions, the gaze of the watcher is internalized to such an extent that each prisoner becomes his or her own watch person. Similarly, we could argue that this is what allows rules and regulation to be internalized so as to inform our actions, behaviors, and even our beliefs. Moreover, the manner in which we naturalize and internalize rules, it could be claimed, causes society to be less willing to contest unjust laws and accept a dominant outlook. Similar to how the inmates are not aware whether or not they're being watched, we are not aware that we have been controlled through naturalized dominant rules rooted in our own culture. This internalized asymmetrical power structure could be seen in the notion of male gaze. In her essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema, Laura Mulvey exposes the asymmetry of social and political power relations between men and women. Mulvey claims that the male gaze serves to depict women as the object of pleasure for the heterosexual male viewer. Besides the fact that women are regularly subject to sexual harassment whenever they enter public space through various forms of looked-atness, women have absorbed all this unconsciously as a form of internalized male gaze. What if women were to subvert this through the power of their gaze? Could we draw upon computer vision technologies to allow women to know when onlookers are staring at them? Augmented with facial and gaze tracking technology and smart materials, this cape responds to the onlooker's gaze. The project engages with broader social issues such as the male gaze on the female body. The facial tracking algorithm in this piece detects age, gender, and gaze of the onlooker. While we know that gender is performative and it doesn't depend on pure representation, the movement of the garment based on the viewer's gaze could unfold a new sets of social meanings. If you are the wearer, you know which part of your body is being looked at, and if you are an onlooker, you know that your action is being noticed. The aim is to see how different strategies could be used to undermine the patriarchal system by developing a form of resistance using surveillance technology. I wonder, what do we see as we gaze out to the world? As a thought experiment, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan invites us to envision ourselves before a female mantis. The female mantis is known for devouring its partner after sex. In Lacan's experiments, we're wearing a mask, and we do not know whether the mask represents us as a female or male, and therefore we don't know whether or not we will be eaten by the female mantis. We simply do not know what we are to the other, and we often project our own very biases to the other in order to understand the other. In fact, we don't see anyone as they are, rather we see them as we are. And how we are is informed by the conformity to many of behavioral assumptions dictated by laws and customs. Although the colonial, racist, and sexist gaze might project oppression, backwardness, and terrorism onto the image of Muslim women wearing a burqa, I would like to stress the inherent difference between a mask and masquerade. While the mask hides, the masquerade reveals. But perhaps we could suggest that both are acting to some extent as a shield against the intrusive gaze. This project is inspired by the historical mask worn by Bandari women from southern Iran. It has been said that these masks were developed during Portuguese colonial rule as a way of protecting the wearer from the gaze of a slave master looking for pretty women. From these Iranian masks protecting women from the patriarchal oppression, to masks of Northwest Coast Indians, to masks worn as political statements, masks take on a range of different religious, social, and political roles, and offer an interesting insight into how we could use them to either conceal or reveal our identities. While these Iranian masks cover most of the wearer's face except the eye, I've been wondering how the eyes could be used as an expressive medium for communication. In my research, I came across an interesting incident in which an American officer uses blinking to send a secret message. In this video, you're seeing Admiral Jeremiah Denton blinking the word torture using Morse code during his captivity in Vietnam.
The so-called definite law. Do you think that's present about?
Well, I don't know what is happening, but whatever the position of my government is, I support it fully. Well, whatever the position of my government is, I believe in it. Yes, sir. I am a member of that government.
The use of code for communication is nothing new, and in fact, women came up with a code word as a method for reporting domestic abuse during this lockdown. In this project, I was particularly inspired by a recent experiment involving 2 AI bots at the Facebook AI lab. The intention was to monitor how 2 bots might develop a dialogue. However, during this experiment, the bots seemingly started to formulate their own language, a language that no human could understand. The researchers had to intervene and tweak the algorithms to prevent this from happening. The story could also reveal how knowledge is power, and inability to understand unnerves those who wish to maintain their authority. For the source text of this project, I used the seminal article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, by the feminist theorist Gayatri Spivak. She asked whether it might be possible for the colonized, or the subaltern, to have a voice in the face of colonial oppression. Using machine learning algorithm, we can use Markov chain to create a text. We represent each word as a state and view transitions as the likelihood that a specific word might go after another. We can consider these states at either a word or character level, and we can analyze what the probability might be of a given letter appearing after 3 letters. The n-grams of a given text provides a strategy for generating the next text. The Markov chain could be therefore used to generate text where each new letter is dependent upon the previous letters. As the mask communicates using BLE protocol, the algorithm is repeated and the n-grams changes. The smaller the engram gets, the less meaning there is in the generated text from the linguistic perspective. Each letter generated through this process is translated into Morse code, which informs the movement of the actuators. In the video documentation of this project, which will be shown shortly, you will see two women wearing masks, covered with eyelashes controlled by AI. They begin to communicate with each other, blinking their eyelashes in rapid succession. The aim is to develop a secret message for transmitting information between multiple women. The project brings together design, critical thinking, feminism, and AI. Churchill once said, "We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us." But doesn't this suggest a form of technological determinism? After all, there is no inherent application for any tool. A knife could be used as a murder weapon or just as a tool for cutting an apple. Similar arguments could be made about surveillance. The question we should ask are, in what context, how, and for whom are we using it? We should be aware of potential problems with AI. For once an issue is recognized as problem, it becomes a different kind of problem. It becomes a problem not by which we are trapped, but rather with which we can deal. Bias is certainly a problem which originates from human beings and is replicated and even exacerbated in AI. As we are training the artificial algorithms to learn to see the world, it is important to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be seen by the machine? And through the lens of what kind of data are they trained to look out to the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Behnaz. It's a really wonderful presentation on your research on the gaze and surveillance, and the research really on a kind of cross-disciplinary creative practice in design, critical thinking, feminism, fashion, interaction design, ultimately really about empowerment within this context that you sketch about surveillance. As mentioned earlier, if you've joined us late for our audience, Safiya Umoja Noble is unfortunately unwell today and not able to join us. So we have more time. Well, we had more time for presentations, and we have more time for questions and discussions. So I'll initiate maybe a first question, and then we'll pass it back and forth between Pablo and myself. So the first area of discussion or questioning concerns AI with respect to the human-machine relationship, which is a deeply intertwined condition ongoing for several decades in the design disciplines. Ultimately, where lies responsibility in the relinquishing of some degree of human agency? In the years of what we used to call the digital revolution in architecture, the skeptic's mantra was often a call for social responsibility. Within our contemporary technological milieu of our discussion about AI today, we entrust increasingly greater decision-making power to systems based on non-human agency. Whether computers can have consciousness is a different question than one which Mark Coeckelbergh asks in his insightful book, AI Ethics, where, Mark, you query the limit of what computers cannot do. Although machines, or let's rather call them algorithms, can indeed design for us and make key decisions with us or for us through machine intelligence, and within the design disciplines, what are our human and societal and professional responsibilities in this milieu? This question may be more directly a kind of legal question regarding, for example, automated cars, which is a sort of go-to sort of example in some ways in AI ethics. Designers may articulate this question more so as, where does creativity and human agency lie in automated and intelligent systems? And within non-human intelligence, questioning the moral status of AI computational neural networks. To what standards of moral agency are we requiring AI systems to uphold? Asked in another way, as algorithms are so-called human-made, to what extent do we share a stake of onus for the actions of AI systems?
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Deep series of questions. I'm sorry, it's not one question.
No problem. I do think that that yes, since it's human made, but also human used. So I think there's the development technically, and but there's also the use of the technology. So since we do both of them as humans, we do have a responsibility. So we should not present AI as something that has nothing to do with human agency, as something that's external to human affairs, something that's almost alien, right? Sometimes it's presented like that, and I think it's important to see the many connections and links between what the algorithm does and what humans does or did, in the past. So as I explained in the book, there are often many hands in technological processes. And in this case, it means this algorithm has been created and programmed. It has been trained on specific data which have been selected by humans. It is used in a very specific context, a particular architectural project, and so on. So I think it's good to keep the human in view, and also put the responsibility on the human. I think only humans have that capacity to exercise responsibility, moral responsibility at least. And they should do it, because otherwise we get in a situation where we don't know anymore not only who sees us, as the previous speaker has so beautifully shown, but also who decides, and we just don't have an idea anymore what's behind the screen, because it's just one big technological net or mesh. And so I think it's important to work to reveal these human connections and these societal issues. And I think bias, which has also been mentioned, is a really great example, because the bias that is in the process of what the algorithm does with the data actually is also in society. So it would be wrong to say oh, this is just a question about human versus algorithm agency or so. It's already there in society, and it has to do with the way we humans deal with one another and with the power structures in our society. So that's why for me these algorithms are political, not because they are some kind of thing by itself that decides or something, but more because it's linked to all these big political questions.
Clearly, it's humans who make the technology, humans who train algorithms or find and enter data, and the use of technology and the decision making, as we call it. So by what measures can bias begin to be debugged from how we train, program, design machinery, unleash machinery, and make decisions which do, as you say, they sort of mirror the broader societal imbalances and biases.
Yeah, so I think it has to be done at different levels and different times. So in the technical sphere, we have the design teams. Here it could be architects, and the question is also there, are these teams sufficiently diverse enough? Do they manage to, even if not sufficiently diverse, do they manage perhaps to somehow bring in that diversity by some other kind of process, some consultation, some participatory process? So that's one way we can do something about it. We can also look at how the algorithm is programmed and try to do something on that side. We can look at the data sets and try to improve them in terms of, for example, how representative they are of the population, and with all its diversity. And in the end, I think it's a political project also. We have to connect it with general questions about what kind of society do we want? Do we want a society that deals with minority groups in the way it does now, or do we want some different society? And if we want a different society, this can be technically translated into algorithms that, for example, could give a positive bias to certain groups. It's a big question. It's not so, it's a complex issue, and it's not so clear always what needs to be done. But I think we should experiment with this kind of interventions.
I don't know if Behnaz, you want to say anything in relation?
Yeah, I mean, really fascinating conversation about the ethical aspects of AI. And I guess one thing that I would like to add is also the opportunity when we're using this type of AI system to look at it as a way that they can reveal something new about our underlying biases. And I think this is something that it's less been talked about. My sense is that most of the conversation about AI is that, oh, AI has bias, but we don't actually address that this bias comes from us, and it gets really kind of amplified in AI systems. And perhaps this could provide opportunity for us to reveal that what are the underlying very hidden layers of sexism and racism and these layers that it's been hidden underneath the surface. For instance, when we are using let's say using AI for HR or recruiting services, what does that actually mean? I mean, we're talking about automation, but when the criteria for choosing the best client is based on a series of algorithms that it's been written for choosing the best candidate for a job based on their color of skin, based on what is their intonation, what is how many words they use per seconds. This is already kind of really showing very kind of nuanced sets of biases that kind of leak into the AI systems. So it is opportunity to go back to how those systematic form of discriminations are beneath the layer, and we revisit those. But it is very important to not rely on AI systems with just the closed eyes and evaluators of those systems.
Well, in that sense, to me, this brings me up to the next question that I had in mind to both Mark and you, Behnaz, particularly in relationship to Mark presented in terms of the politics of authorship, which is particularly an aspect of research that I'm interested in. I've been working many years, and I know Neil is also working. He put in the chat about his new book, but also in relationship to what Behnaz you mentioned in terms of media determinism, but particularly the attention that you pay to linguistics. I'm fascinated by both of your presentations in terms of how well could one articulate the relation between authorship and language, for instance? And I think it's a key here. To me, technology in relationship to the context of late capitalism presents the issue of disruption, right? The systems of productions are continuously revolutionized, presenting radical opportunities, but also problems, right, as we are discussing now. To me, there is an issue of what is the architecture of information, which is a subject that we presented back with Aaron Sprecher in 2013. And in relationship to what Mark said about the death of the author, right? In relationship to Ronald Barthes, I mean, Ronald Barthes presented the death of the author in terms of language career for literature. So it's a question to both of you, and I don't know if you have any comments on it.
Thanks. I could not hear the whole question because there was a problem with the sound, suddenly was gone. But I think that the question about democracy is really important, and I can imagine that that in the design and architecture community there has been on participatory design and how to work with stakeholders and things like that. Is this something that would be useful in this context?
Yes, I mean, actually, what I was referring to in terms of what you were discussing about authorship, right? Like, what is the possibility of the architects rather than applying technology and rather than applying existing data? I was proposing what I call the architecture of information, which is to develop systems of representation, to develop technologies, and to develop our own data. So, and I was relating that in relationship to what Behnaz was mentioning in terms of media determinism and linguistic problems.
Yes, and to that I could say that it's like this problem of the power of big tech is very relevant here, right? So I think we need to develop our own infrastructures that are more geared towards the common good, I think, because if we don't do that, we basically don't have control over our tools, as designers, as architects, but also as users on a daily basis. So I think it's definitely a matter of power and empowerment through technological tools and infrastructures.
Maybe I can also add a few. I totally agree that the question of empowerment has become really important. I also think that when we are thinking about artificial intelligence system, it's very important that how are we considering these systems? Are we considering as sort of replacements to human intelligence? Or as Mark mentioned, is it more sort of empowerment or enhancements, almost this type of collaboration between human and artificial systems? And I also strongly agree that we should really kind of change our mindset from kind of replacing that the super intelligent systems going to replace our intelligence, but how are we going to collaborate or enhance or augment or empower ourselves with this type of system? And then the next question that comes after this is that who are we empowering? And I think this is where I'm really interested to see how artificial intelligence systems could help those marginalized groups, those that their voice haven't been heard, their image haven't been seen, to help those to be empowered. So these times we kind of subverting the systems instead of having these systems to benefit big corporates or the capital. Could we at least try to see how those systems could empower those who throughout history their voice haven't been heard? And it's not easy, but I think as more designers and I would say creative people get hold of this type of working with this type of technologies, either from training their own data sets to working with ready-made sort of models, they could start questioning and kind of tinkering and repurposing this type of systems. And I want to stay optimistic that it is possible that we move toward that sort of future in which we shape that type of conversation also for advancement of new technologies.
Tom, I know that we have another question, but Neil is asking if he could intervene. I don't know, Neil, if you want to say anything in relationship to your book, your upcoming book.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, thank you for the presentations. Really great. I just want maybe a couple of comments before I ask my question. That is, I think the death of the author. I mean, Mark actually was very to the point when he said that architects only designed 5% of the buildings, and I think, I mean, not only that, but I think architects have an overinvested notion of how much they can control the world through their architecture. I think that Foucault's subsequent comments beyond the kind of panopticon, the discussion he had with Paul Rabinow, I don't know if you know this piece, Mark, but Space, Knowledge, Power, where, I mean, he's clarifying the panopticon does not control people. It's the system that's controlling them ultimately. It's simply a kind of a mechanism that allows that power to be transferred in a certain way. But I do think that architects are really, in terms of death of the author, they really don't have that much say in how society, how the buildings are being used, and so on. But I just want to pick up on something with that Mark said, because I really appreciate Mark's contribution. I thought it was fabulous for many reasons. I like the fact that you're asking questions, Mark. You're not sort of making kind of, you're asking, interrogating things. And that, to my mind, is the kind of the real purpose of theory, if not to say philosophy, to problematize things, to really interrogate them, to ask things, and not to use theory as a kind of way to, a kind of manifesto for a way of thinking, but rather to interrogate things. So I really appreciate that. I thought it was a fantastic presentation. But I've got one particular question, which I think is kind of maybe I take a slightly different sort of viewpoint in terms of the human-machine interaction. I guess that I mean, I don't know if you know the work of Andy Clark, and I guess you must do through David Chalmers and things. But the notion, I think, the extended mind and the whole debate about natural-born cyborgs. I was with him the other day in Brighton and talking about some of these things. And I guess what to my mind is interesting is when we talk about collaboration, what do we really mean? And at the back of my mind, and this is my own personal opinion, I'm highly suspicious of Bruno Latour and actor network theory. I really think there's a danger there of projecting agency onto objects. I don't think they have that agency. And in terms of the kind of debate that's going on between between Andy Clark and others in terms of the kind of the kind of post-human. I mean, Andy Clark really takes this view that actually the point is that it's human beings who use this technology as a kind of prosthesis, and it's thanks to the kind of the plasticity of the brain and the fact that we can adapt those things and work through them. That's really how he sees it, really. So we're still in control. And it's a real mistake to try and think about this kind of collaboration that is going on. It's, in a way, it's more straightforward than that. And I think that we have to take responsibility for these things. And that's why I tend to sort of subscribe to what was behind Behnaz's argument, the idea that we have to sort of see tools in terms of what Gibson would call affordances and things, and we work through our tools, but we are, my position anyways, is that we are ultimately in charge and we have to take responsibility for it. We can't, a bad theorist blames the tools. That would be my theory.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Neil, for these comments. I think very important issues that you're touching, and not only for design, but more generally. Let me say first, what I really like about Latour is that he manages to sketch some kind of alternative to modern thinking, or at least pushes the boundaries of modern thinking, and tries to see, like, okay, what if we think differently about things, right? For example, speaking on behalf of the climate or something, for me, this can be theorized by Latour. And so I find it interesting to question the boundaries, nature, culture, and so on. What I do agree with, however, is that that doesn't mean that things are agents in the sense of separate beings that do things. They have consequences, and they shape things more than we think, and that's why I think the extension metaphor, extension concept is probably too weak. I mean, it doesn't say too much about this kind of invisible shaping that technology and media do to us. So that's why I'm not so happy with the extension concept. But yes, ultimately humans have to take responsibility. So all this theory should not be used to evade responsibility, for sure. And so that kind of consequences of non-modern thinking, postmodern thinking, and so on should definitely be avoided if that's the direction it's going. But I think we can do better, and yeah, how to exactly conceptualize the relation between humans and technology. Also in philosophy of technology, there is theory about it, but it will remain a challenge, and that's why I also formulated. I mean, as a philosopher, I generally formulate questions, but it is for me still very open, and we're probably still only at the very beginning, you know, of trying to understand these new kinds of technologies that really influence society, influence our identity, and so on, in less visible ways, and how to conceptualize it. It's still, you know, I'm doing my best with last point, I use the term performance sometimes, so like techno performances, and that's partly to lock humans and technology together, but also to say like, hey, but it's still the human who performs with the technology, and performance also in a bodily sense. And I do like all these enactive approaches and so on, you know, that really see the human as embodied and enactive. So I think we should never forget the human and the human body also.
It's we're sort of oscillating between either calls for the designer, the architect, to have greater control, whilst also bemoaning the death of the architect at the extreme, or the inability to kind of affect power structures. And on the one hand, we have, say, the darker, more sinister kind of context of surveillance and power structures, but a call, you know, as Behnaz, you articulate so beautifully in your work, for betterment and empowerment within this context. And as I heard you, Behnaz, speaking earlier, it reminds me of the arguments of the democratization of technology that we hear still so much, to do with maker culture, to do with the physical technologies of people having a 3D printer somewhere right next to their computer, in their studio or at home, for example. But that democratization of technology seems within the context of AI, which is so pervasive. We're talking about databases that pre-exist. We're talking about technologies that are made and unleashed. And where does that place the designer between a wish for betterment and empowerment and power structures that do we really, you know, to what extent do we have capacities to regain the control that we're bemoaning?
It's a great question, Tom. I mean, the question of democratization of tools and technologies that we have, and DIY movement was absolutely helpful in that, which allowed a lot of people to have hands-on in making and a lot of digital fabrication, digital design tools. But also, I believe that in the last few years, we're seeing a new sort of opening also in a lot of artificial intelligence systems, in which the systems are no longer just pre-trained sets of data for designers or coders, creative programmers, but actually We are seeing the new waves of possibilities for even in architectural or design schools. We are seeing that the students are learning how they can train their own data sets. So it's no longer they just like use the pre-trained models, but they actually actively start gathering data, working with preparing their own data sets, training their own models. And this is exciting. This is absolutely exciting because we don't know what would be the consequence, but the reality is that we are like our architecture or design students are learning to think about these systems, not in terms of just there is this black box that I have no idea how this is written, but I'm able to train my system so I can basically have a facial tracking system that it's more racially justice. So it's very I think it opens up new possibilities, and from that perspective, I also strongly believe that education system should change and accommodate these new changes. Our new students should be open to learning the newest tools and computational systems on how they should understand AI, because the future of our lives is going to be heavily informed by this system. So we have to understand that how we could manipulate it, how we could think through it, and how could we repurpose it. So that's, I would say, it's a crucial aspect of our education that needs to be changed, and it is changing already. So it's that we are moving in that direction, but perhaps it should be in higher speed.
You know, to me, in that sense, the question of the training of the data set, I just wonder what's going on with AI and neural nets in the relationship, not only in relationship between linguistics, but the relationship between linguistics and mathematics, and the structures through which we funnel information, and how much, I think, Mark, you touch upon the critical point here, which is how much architects understand of what's going on in terms of the black box. And I think that unavoidably, and I think it's happening in all the disciplines, right? That if you are not the coder of the representational system, you're not you're not really getting into in terms of what you're producing at the computational thinking level in anything, right? In biology, you know, any other discipline. If you're not in other words, pairing the thinking level with the computational thinking level, I think you're out of the game automatically. And I don't think it's only about training the data set, because the problem is in convolution, how convolutional systems are actually presenting structures in systems of representation that are conventional. So for instance, in architecture, we have been developing very sophisticated systems of representation historically, and they're all being wiped out by software programmers or computational scientists that are presenting architectural interfaces in a very conventional terms. And to me, this brings the problem that Derrida mentioned in terms of the structure producing objects, which is his notion of the parergon and the ergon, right? The problematic relationship between how much you are thinking the structure beforehand, the object that produces the result. So in that sense, to me, we have two problems to address. Not only what we do with the system, but how we understand the logic of the system and how we can actually intervene at higher authorship levels to actually create our own systems and modify data structures and also economic structures. Because I think if we don't intervene at the means of production, we are totally irrelevant. And I think in that sense, capitalism and capitalists are very aware of the control of the means of production and the infrastructure to project a way of manipulating reality. And I think architects, we are always working at the much lower result level. And I think that in Marx's terms, the only way is to actually compete at that level in order to be culturally relevant. In that sense, to me, the second problem today is digital feudalism. The fact that we depend more and more on concentrated levels of power. And if you're not in a digital feudal, you're actually also, you cannot survive, because 1 second that you get distracted and your system is totally wiped out by an AI boot that is fighting the other boot, right? So in that sense, it seems to me that blockchain is one of those technologies that allows for democracy to be opening up a different parallel reality in relationship to what control of money, control of validation, right? Because social media, we know what's going on, right? It's creating bubbles, right? Social validation, self-validation bubbles, right? Which ends up being turns into misinformation and so on. So, and that directly affects the physicality of our cities. It's not only virtual, right? It's virtual and physical. So in that sense, to me, the question between digital feudalism and the possibilities of blockchain to actually break through this issue at the democratic level seems to me that are presenting the two big paradigms to address the questions that we are actually now discussing.
I think you make a good point about it's not just virtual but also material, and especially in the 90s we thought too much in terms of virtual versus real, and I think we are now in a situation where these technologies are pervading everything, and there is no line between offline and online, and so we have to really conceptualize that and rethink that. And it also means that yeah, we can also look at level of production. I would also use the word communication here, because often what happens is that there are kind of epistemic barriers between different people, between different times. So someone designs an algorithm to use for, for example, in architecture, and maybe the next day it can be used in a drone that kills people. I mean, this is just an extreme example, but these technologies are really powerful, and they have different knowledge contexts. And I think if we don't have people talking to each other and flows of knowledge and not just information, these things get out of grip and have their own dynamics, and can be easily used by people who just want more power and money. So I think to counter that, we need something else. Blockchain, I don't know if it's sometimes also a kind of utopia that's projected there, right? I don't know if it will work, or, but it's definitely good to think about something very disruptive and very, very different than what we have. And always in technological and material sense also, not just only like, oh, we need a different culture or a different education. It's definitely also we need different materialities and structures and infrastructures.
Could I just chip in, Pablo, and just...
Oh, Neil, go ahead. Please.
Say something quickly. I mean, just in terms of the Paragon, I mean, I think, in a way, I always take that book, Truth in Painting, to be about architects also. The idea that we kind of, and it's not just, the painting is framed within its kind of, its economic, social context, and we tend to sort of fetishize the object itself. And I think that architects fetishize the buildings and overlook the kind of they aestheticize things and overlook the kind of social controls that are in there. And I just want to kind of add a comment really to kind of support in some way what Mark is saying, because Mark spoke about the death of the architect, and that happens to be the title of the book after next that I'm working on, The Death of the Architect, the demise of the architecture profession in the age of AI. And what I want to sort of put to Mark is that, I think that the picture you presented of the architect only designing 5% of the buildings is actually, it goes beyond that, because, I mean, what not only is the architect only designing 5% of the buildings, but when they're designing, they're not even in control. I think the idea that we've inherited from the Renaissance of the architect being in control has been displaced by more kind of recent kind of contracts that have been developed, certainly in the UK. And I'm licensed in the UK, so I don't know about other countries, but in the UK, more than 50% of the of building contracts are now design build. In other words, it's not the architect in charge, it is the developer in charge. And that fundamentally, undermines the power of the architect to do anything. That's one thing I'd say. But just in terms of AI, one of the the findings, I'm doing 2 books on AI, right? Well, 3 in fact, but 2 in this one particular series. One is got a white cover, it's about how amazing AI is, and one's got a black cover about how it could lead to the death of the architect. And in some ways, they're 2 sides of the same coin, because the more amazing AI becomes, the more it undermines the role of the architect. And one of my findings, which actually goes against what I think the dominant prevailing idea about AI in architecture, which is to say it's an amazing design tool. And I think that Tom and Pablo did a really amazing workshop over the summer where they were exploring use of GANs as a design tool. But to my mind, even though what's coming out of the design studio is incredible and amazing and fascinating and so on, the real issue is going to be something entirely different. And that is to say, it's already become kind of clear that the potential of AI, and it goes back to some of these kind of questions, let's say, of the famous game AlphaGo between this famous Korean Go master and AI. AI started playing moves that nobody understood. We couldn't even grasp because they were so complex. And what's become kind of clear is that AI is doing the same thing in an urban context. I mean, an urban situation is actually super complicated, and we simply can't get our heads around all the data. So what's happening is AI is coming up with solutions that we wouldn't have thought of. We wouldn't have thought of at all. So just as Lee Sedol didn't understand AlphaGo, so architects are not understanding what's happening in terms of these tools. Now, what it's producing basically is it's coming out with solutions we wouldn't have thought of. Now, the important point is this. The clients, i.e. the developers on the whole, are now beginning to insist that architects use AI because it can optimize solutions in terms of return of investment. Now, that is the crucial thing in the end, return of investment. So they're saying you've got to use AI in order to get my return of investment. Now, it's a slippery slope from when you go there to when AI takes over completely. I think it becomes the kind of the same logic of the self-driving car. Once the car can drive itself, you don't need you don't need a driver. And once AI can produce solutions that are better than architects can do, you don't need an architect. So I think that this whole picture is actually far more complicated, and I want to congratulate you on not falling for the kind of the hype that architects do of coming up with saying we're completely in control, because we are losing control. And the point about my subsequent book is not that AI is fully responsible for it at all, but we're already in a situation whereby we've got so little control about the design of buildings, it's going to be eroded further by these mechanisms that are clearly in some ways superior to what architects can do.
Yes, it's a gradual process, isn't it? It's a gradual process of giving more to the technology. I think in the beginning of my talk, I tried to get it across also, and it's not only in architecture, but everywhere. And I think it's still a human decision in the end, a political decision. How far do we let that go? I don't think it's a deterministic kind of thing. So we can still say like up to there and no further if we want to.
I mean, just maybe a final comment to pick up on something that Tom's former colleague from the AA, Patrick Schumacher, made, and that's to say that already computational systems are doing work that otherwise architects would do in the office. So there's already a kind of a pressure on there. And I think one of the problems in a way that the people who try to analyze AI versus humans is they've seen it as a one-to-one thing. Actually, it's not that at all. What is happening increasingly is the use of AI as a form of extended intelligence. It's not just simply kind of us versus them. And the danger is that the situation is that one person with this kind of prosthesis, as it were, can do the job of about 12 people. That's the real problem. So, and it was a comment that, Tom Main made this comment, actually. Tom Main's a very famous architect based in LA. He's a Pritzker Prize winner. And he made this comment. He said, I would quite like that. Instead of having 80 people in an office, I have just 12 people. I know these people really well, and we can work with them. And of course, that's great. But what happens to the 68 people who then get displaced by that thing? So it's a super complicated question. And I think we have to do exactly what Pablo's saying, step beyond our focus and look at the broader picture, the frame in which we are operating.
Maybe provocatively, one can say that the relinquishing of both authorship and control, and in some ways that's what we're talking about, has been going on for decades, in effect. And I think it's a more general technological question. It's also one that pervaded all through the eras, multiple eras of postmodernism. And at a certain time, the relinquishing of authorship and control was seen as a beneficial, even positive possibility within the design disciplines. I think what we're talking about, and I love the idea, Neil, that you have this two-part book, which is dark and sinister, the other is about a kind of project of betterment, let's say, or a kind of more positive future. This might segue very nicely to shift towards speculations about the future of AI, which I think in 2021 is very difficult to be super optimistic about the future. But this questioning might raise age-old issues about architecture and design as a project of betterment. I recall Rem Koolhaas expressing in a public lecture, I think also at the AA some years ago, that all architects have a utopian gene, in that a degree of utopianism is in our DNA, and at least to make the world a better place, and whether or not the extent to which that's possible. But AI potentially creates, or at least at the moment, what it creates is statistical models of reality, not reality itself. There are ways of conceiving, simulations, digital twins, other sorts of models of augmentation and enhancement of our capacity to model reality, even to predict the future. Models and systems as such intend to augment security, safety, and control more often than they create equity, brotherhood, and liberty. And aside from accountability, fairness, and equity, we can also consider the ethics of the environment and ethics of the non-living for life on Earth. Design ethics can now also consider the planet as a whole. I think, Mark, you mentioned this in your presentation and some of your responses. And shifting from an anthropocentric bias towards an ecological ethics for all living species, our oceans, our non-organic Earth, etc. And if I wanted to save the world's ecological environment, or to properly feed more or all of the human species, how could AI ethics be applied through design to maintain a higher ethical position with respect to the planet's ecology, as well as to mitigate poverty, hunger, disease? And I ask these questions sort of earnestly. Will AI serve to empower those more vulnerable and powerless, or will AI continue to shore up the wealthy, powerful, and developed nations and ubiquitous corporations? I put this as a sort of fork in the road question, more provocatively than necessarily they're going to have a black cover or a white cover.
I can start, Mark. Tom, I really like this question. At the same time, I have like inherent problem with kind of seeing technology or AI as almost solving towards solution, like problems as a solution towards problems of either ecological, social, cultural, to say if now we are waiting for technology to now answer all the mess that we have produced in the world, it's just maybe a wrong kind of entry to the question. So if we are looking how these technology, again, is the question of enhancement or augmentation, would they assist us to move in that direction? I really like this question, because now we are actually asking that how could we move in that direction with the help and assistance of these type of technologies. But the problem that I see a lot of time is happening is that we just project too much into this technology. We say that, oh, we have the problem with housing crisis, no problem. AI can solve our housing problem. We have problem with recruitment systems, no problem. We have AI system that can help us. And this attitude is become really almost overemphasis on something that almost diminish human responsibility and accountability toward these systems. So I would say that we need to reframe this question, that how the system could help us or assist us to move in that direction. And in that case, yes, I would say that and some of the remarks that Mark made in terms of how we could really see the bigger picture and how could we move toward also other species. I think they're an ecological sustainability. I think it's very, very important. And these are the questions that should be included when we are addressing this type of technological innovations.
I think in that sense, to me, there are some things that we should be a little bit aware of. First, to me, that there is a question of information and data. To me, there is no information, there is no data with a sense of representation. To say that, for instance, that data is extrinsic and reality and we just need to understand it, I think is an erroneous notion. And that happens the same with the problem of language, right? How we actually project according, in terms of Derrida's signifier, right? How we produce signification when we actually represent things and we produce a reality. For me, technology is a form of knowledge, a knowledge that actually functions, right? In that sense, we cannot separate ourselves from technology. We cannot say like a system as if it is an abstract or a technology as if it is something other than us, because we are actually somebody develops the technology. And somebody makes the discovery or a relationship between mathematics, communication systems, and computation, and so on. So in that sense, to me, the real argument here is how much are we able to go up in terms of the structural, symbolic forms, right, to address the form of the system and address the form of the technology, so that we don't fall into the trap of separating ourselves and just simply implementing the technology, which is exactly what you're saying, right? If we are applying a technology, we are going to inevitably project the same conditions that we are complaining about, because that's going to be a preset package. That's a problem of software identified by, of course, people that use open source, right? If you use a software, right, that means that you're falling into the set of ideologies that software is being constructed as. That's what you call media determinism, for instance, right? In that sense, to me, I'm particularly interested in the form of ideologies that are projected within the technology. So, for instance, if you enter a system of representation, any software, you're already entering into a form of space, a form of architecture, a form of processing data. In that sense, to me, the real failure in terms of Mark's sense, and perhaps Neil, I agree with what you're saying, is the fact that architects, we fell into the trap of looking at the result, and I'm particularly interested in having that discussion in terms of how the schools of architecture are fascinated with image production, right, versus the systems of production. And in that sense, you see that in the corporate world, right? Everybody's like just using this app, using the other app, and then it's a convolution of multiple sets of systems that are running. And who has the real power? The developers that develop the app, of course, right? And then the people that fall into using a technology are just relegating not only authorship, they're really relegating themselves. So for instance, as you augment your body through applications and technology, one of the biggest dangers that I was talking with neuroscientists is a dependent on memory extension. Memory is our main function of intelligence, right? So if we outsource memory to our devices, we are relegating automatical intelligence, because you cannot have intelligence without memory, because you cannot recall and produce conceptual liaisons. So in that sense, to me, the form of the technology and the form of the system that we're implementing are the political battle that we're fighting. And if we are not engaged into that system of production, I think the schools of architecture are becoming, that's why they're becoming irrelevant, because they don't understand the fact that the real revolution is happening now outside academia with all these startups, right? Those are the modifiers of the world. My students are, some of them are getting $10 million. Like, is more money than a school of architecture, right? That's where the real battle and the real transformation of things is happening in capitalist terms. But then you have to be aware that that's also a problem, right? So I think that, to me, what is interesting about this discussion is to open up the conditions that we need to be aware of so that we are able to expand our role in relationship to what's going on.
Could I just, sorry, Behnaz, do you want to?
I just wanted to thing I'm hearing from Pablo, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly, but I want to sort of make some comments on it. And I think if you mean that, I also, that aspects of it, I really appreciate, which sort of like this sort of overemphasis, especially when we're talking like, let's say, neural network and like, let's say, GANs, like the overemphasis on representation, on sets of visual information, and then feeding into training a model and then producing a new sets of visual content, either for art purposes or for design or for architectural form. The problem that I see in such systems is, I guess, as you were mentioning, is the fact that there's so much emphasis on pure representation of image-based content versus the reality of how the perception is taking place is too much about how you move your body, how you sense with different type of multi-sensory experience of the world, from smell to touch to hearing and auditory, and a lot of information that helps our perception, versus in many of these systems it lacks these basics of human perception or animal perception, which is about this multi-sensory experience of the world, and reduced down to this type of data sets that they are purely representational. So I think that also the bigger question for this type of system is how we account for this type of experiences. And I think Mark also mentioned this with experience of VR, for instance, how we can bring the feelings, the senses into AI systems. I think it remains a very, very important unanswered questions.
Could I just chip in something quickly, kind of relating to VR? Just maybe in response to Tom's initial kind of comment about reality. I'm always very suspicious when people use the term reality. I have been since Coca-Cola was advertised as being the real thing. And there is actually a book coming out very soon, David Chalmers, which is about VR, which is basically saying that actually our own understanding of reality is very virtualized. This is David is coming out in August. And it's very similar to the kind of work that's going on in neuroscience. I think the ideas of Anil Seth about how our perception of the world is a kind of form of controlled hallucination, and so on and so on. His book, Being You, is coming out in October as well. So I think that in some ways we've got to be cautious about the idea of just talking about reality as though it's this innocent thing. And I think the kind of question of ideology enters into our own sort of worldview. You know, we are simply not aware of it, perhaps, but it is there and it is controlling us. And this is where, just to go back to kind of what Pablo's comment about Derrida, what is interesting about Derrida is his kind of the viewpoint that he took, that we have a constructed notion of how we operate, and of course a constructed notion of what we think architecture is about, and so on and so on and so on, that we're subject to these kind of privileged hierarchies, we have these distortions that we've inherited through language, and so on and so on. What is interesting is AI is validating that in some sense and showing, yes, there are already biases within the system, and it's the humans that are kind of biased in their own way. So I'd want to kind of highlight the fact that kind of that we ourselves already operating within an ideological framework which is distorting how we operate, and that's why I'm suspicious of the term reality whenever it's been used.
I think, just to clarify, I foregrounded the last question with a statement about AI which creates statistical models of reality or representations more visually, not reality itself. And many of these devices or environments where we create models and systems to kind of simulate or create a digital twin, or to the augmentation of through extended forms of reality. And I think that the way that in this kind of multidisciplinary field, of capturing and understanding what we describe as reality isn't innocent. I agree with you, absolutely.
I don't know if Gustavo, you were putting some things in the chat. I don't know if you have any questions or comments, or anybody else. But Gustavo, yes.
So, hello. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the wonderful event today. I'm actually very excited about hearing about ethics. But my question, I think, would be for all of you. I think there is a limitation that architects have, but also it's our responsibility to push. So what do you think is the role of contemporary architects today and their responsibility to push politicians or to push policy forward so that there is a more ethical notion of design, and also looking after our clients and the people that we design for? Because most likely, if we're lucky, the buildings that we design will last hundreds of years. But I think that's also a mythology too. So if you guys can please comment.
I think the issue of the client is problematic in architecture. I think we need to get rid of the notion of the patriarchal notion of the client. At least for me, in my practice, we don't have clients. We eliminated the notion of working for somebody, and I think it is related in a mirror-like position, is related to the condition of the role that you occupy as an architect in society. I think that we need to go beyond the typification of the relationship between one and the other. By the way, in terms of, Gustavo, what you're saying is very funny, because the neoliberal model has been pushing architects away from the urban policy, right? There's no architects in most cities in the world controlling or zero power, right? The developers, as Neil was saying, have been substituted. Cities became businesses, right? So the developer, thinking in terms of money optimization, is a real power broker, not only at the level of the building, but also construction, but also the form of the city. Willis has this fantastic book, Form Follows Finance, 1995, in which denounces all the practices. In that sense, to me, the frontier of democracy is validation, right? Measurement and validation. How are we? No, I think individually we're not going to be able to do anything. I think it has to be a social change, and it has to be political, and it has to be at many levels, because if the context is not the right one, individually you may be able to change something, but I don't believe in the capitalist notion of the hero, that one person can change everything. We see what's going on, right? Billionaires are escaping to another planet, or they're interested in mining an asteroid to be the total owner of everything, and tax policies are deteriorating the social fabric, right? So the question to me is, how are we aware of the context, and how we're able to understand what is our position in that context, and how we modify that context.
Mm-hmm. I would also like to take up this word push, right? I mean, I think, so yes, push can mean social change and increasing legitimacy, but it can also mean push, like what Behnaz said about sense and experience. I think, architects has not been shown yet, or letting us experience things that we didn't experience yet. And in the last decades, technology development has been doing that. And unfortunately, it was mainly driven by capitalism, but we can also do it other ways maybe. But I think it's this push is important, to not only listen to client and base things democratically in stakeholders, but also at the same time use the creativity to open up new possibilities for human experience. That's a big word, but I think it's I think all creative people have a sort of responsibility there to push for that. So if architects could do that, then I think they can also maybe take again a bigger role in society and in human culture.
And just one quick comments on this question of this type of society scale kind of changes. I think it's going back again to education. And when you're looking in the history, when you're looking at similar also movements that happen towards a more just future, just society, was you can see that, for instance, in Frankfurt School, which was fascinating in terms of how the movement started, what was the intention behind it, and why in architecture or design schools students don't learn about it. I'm always puzzled by this, that why we don't have courses on critical thinking. Students don't learn to think critically, because architecture students learn to just answer a client. You have to understand clients' needs and to your best basically answer the client's needs. And that's part of the profession of being an architect. But I also think that the students have to be exposed to how to critically think about society and culture and politics. And why do I have to even answer someone's need, and to whose benefit, or whose benefit is at the stake? Just understanding the nuance of that landscape is very important, both historically and culturally. So I think I see a lot of these type of questions also go back to how we are going to reshape our education system. And it's very important to make those changes while architects and designers are learning these disciplines.
I just wanted to follow up with Behnaz. I totally agree with her, and with Pablo too. I mean, I guess I would say that education is a big part of it. And I think in my education as an architect, there are quite a few progressions: the one of the family, then the one of the friends, then the one of the institution, and then the one of the clients, and whatever the ecology is of the profession. But then there's different levels of social responsibility. Just because you're taught how to listen doesn't mean you listen. And just because you're given instruction doesn't mean you're going to exact it to the letter. We as architects have the power of imagination and thousands of years of history. And we're primed to actually take more of a leadership in the sciences and education and in policy. And that's why I'm very curious, are we so beholden to capitalism and this money that we are basically chained? And we can't really ask those tough questions. And I think for me, I've been privileged to be in a research institution. So I get to ask these questions and be annoying to my professors in power. But I believe if we trained young architects to do the same, we would have, I think, a much better world, because they would push back. And I agree with Pablo. I mean, I don't think I've had a client in a long time, but when I do think about being serving a client, I actually try to serve society first, and what is the betterment of a future people, instead of the current currency of today.
Seems like much of the last several decades of the design discipline's engagement with technology has been about appropriation or misappropriation, misuse, taking technologies that were never intended for their initial application and using them for wholly other reasons. And one of the things that I think architecture, more than many other design disciplines, is so good at is, in fact, the misbehavior of what we're not supposed to be using a particular kind of technology for. And I think we would not be having this kind of panel discussion without that culture continuing. The culture being, we are very opportunistic as a design discipline. We take from technical culture what we think is most not appropriate, even inappropriate, and we're very in that opportunism. We find directions for research in architecture that were never intended necessarily through those technical systems. I'm not formulating this as a question necessarily, but maybe just as a comment to your comments, Gustavo.
One thing that I wanted to ask Mark, what is our role currently as, I guess, designers and people to the future? Because I don't think we are addressing seriously the ideas of climate change or societal disruption. And I guess one thing that I am very clear about my experiences with Digital Futures, when you start touching and hearing the people in different geographies, there's different levels of suffering and there's different levels of, I would say, what we call kind of living. And the pandemic has been, for me, very clear. We in the West, or at least in the States, I've been privileged to get an injection months before most of the world. Why, as we a global society, why do we accept that? Should we think in global sense or in a local sense? If you can please talk about that, Mark.
Thanks for that question, Gustavo. I think it's both the pandemic and also the climate crisis kind of encourage us, force us to really ask the questions like, do we need to change our lives? Do we need to change our societies? Can we continue doing this to the environment? Can we continue doing this to each other, even if we don't intend to? So for me, this kind of crisis situation, I think it's also a great opportunity to try to change things. And I also see positively, a lot more awareness of this kind of issues, a lot more attention to issues around bias, around being privileged versus non-privileged, global problems. So I think there's also a kind of sense emerging that we cannot go on anymore like we did before. So I think if that kind of energy is channeled in a way that also leads to concrete changes, through professions like in architecture, but also in many different walks of life, I think that that's probably really now a kind of window of opportunity.
I just wanted to say one more thing. Behnaz, I'm very impressed in how bold you are with what you do, just for the simple fact that a lot of my students and some of my colleagues are afraid to speak the truth. And I think maybe that's one example of arts research as signals to culture. We should keep pushing that envelope or those triggers that control us. I think that the more that we have different views, different understandings of the world, I think we would have better solutions. So I just wanted to say I'm a big fan of Behnaz's work, but I also encourage everyone to look at her work and say, what can I do in my world and what can I read? And then how can I transform myself to be an agent of change? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you also, Behnaz. Great work. I also agree. I mean, you want to say something? Yes, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to say thank you, Gustavo, for the kind words. Appreciate that. And I also wanted to just say to your last question, which was to Mark, it's just so important to think about larger questions, because sometimes, especially in the West, either in Europe or in America, we just caught up into this. I mean, me as someone from Iran coming to the West, I can see that here is like a bubble in a way. You're inside this bubble and you just see the things from this perspective. Whenever I travel back to Middle East, I just feel like, wow, there's this whole connection to, and that is also another bubble in a way. So through the lens of each region, we see the other side of the world. But it is important to develop this type of cross-cultural views that it matters for us. I mean, things that happens in Afghanistan right now matters. It's not like just a story. There is things right now happening in Afghanistan and Yemen and all around the world that we as creative people, as designers, we have to address, even if the media and the mainstream media doesn't as much pay attention to them. So yeah, thanks for raising it up. I appreciate that question.
You know, to me, I have to thank both Mark and Behnaz for addressing with such level of criticality this event and the level of seriousness and engagement. I think one of the issues that are a challenge in relationship to where we are today is education, as has been mentioned. And I think that the complicated relationship between students' loans and the cost of education in the US is a big obstacle in relationship to critical thinking, because there is a demand for skills, and skills destroy critical thinking, right? So the neoliberal model has been imposing this idea that education is about skill building, which is totally contrary to a critical functional of education in society, right? And I think that has to change drastically. And that's what I think maybe one of our responsibilities as faculty is to defend and critically address these issues from within, which from within is very difficult, as you're saying, if you're in a bubble, but it has to be globally coordinated and transcultural. So thank you both, Mark and Behnaz. Tom, you want to wrap up and say some few words?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think that the discussion sort of brought up so many issues that maybe we didn't even expect. I mean, it brings us back to the context really of our current multiple crises, you know, health, environmental, etc. And what are the opportunities in effect by our disciplines working within the broad technologies that we can sort of summarize with just a two-letter acronym called AI. I think that there's such opportunity for experimentation, and with our hosts here, Digital Futures, what's so really quite amazing is in the summer your series of workshops, over 100 workshops, at least half, if not 2/3, had worked within a sort of broad umbrella technologically within AI. And there is this wonderful opportunity to experiment as we architects and designers tend to take. We seize those experiments. But today's event really highlights as much as, you know, much of the alarm that we all sense, say the dark side and sinister side of power structures, but also perhaps a hope for a more equitable future where we can hold our profession, designers, all of society to a higher ethical standard. We certainly haven't solved the problems of the world, nor of our disciplines or profession. But at least we begin to kind of bring those issues into the milieu of the thinking and education of designers and architects. So I'd like to thank the Digital Futures team. Some of you are here, but also Philip Yuan. Thank you to Neil, Leach, Gustavo, Antonio, also to those that aren't here that helped put this together, Virginia, Bayana, etc. And to our Dean, Maria Perbellini, for support for this event in our series. And also our series is part of the Virtual Italian Pavilion. So thank you to Alessandro Mellis and Tom Kovac as well. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you all, Behnaz Farahi, Mark Coeckelbergh, for joining us today. We're grateful for your presentations, your insights, and to your contribution to this series. So thank you very much.
Tom, can I make a very quick announcement at the very end here, just to I mean, first of all, thanks so much for this. I mean, it was a great discussion. Mark, that was fantastic. Thanks, Behnaz, it was amazing. I just want to put out there that actually the idea of a tool, actually, of course, theory becomes a tool in Deleuze's terms. And I think what has been so important today has been the critical theoretical interrogation. So thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Tom. Just one comment for next week. For you, we'll be actually having a first of a series of workshops. From our feedback from a questionnaire, we discovered that a lot of our followers wanted to have some technical workshops. We could combine some introductory workshops with some very advanced workshops. workshops. So we're going to, next week it's going to be introductory, it's going to be a Rhino, but then we have VQ, GAN and CLIP in October. So we're starting to initiate a series of Saturdays in which we are working with particular kind of workshops or tutorials, so introducing them in so many ways. And this also was, I guess, today was part of a kind of a new initiative to try and again, in a sense, outsource, a bit like the way that AD is outsourced to guest editors, and it was a really successful experiment. So I just want to thank everyone from NYIT for this. It was really a tremendously professional and a very provocative and interesting session. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the organization, and thank you, Mark and Behnaz. Terrific presentations.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Gustavo.
Thank you. Bye.
And Antonio.